Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Today's Friday, it's Self-Improvement Friday, and my friend John is here to talk to us about that. John, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. So yeah, anybody who is new just joining, we are talking about The Machine Stops. It's a short story by E.M. Forster, about 20, 30 pages. And I'm looking at this through the view, there's a lot of interpretations about this work in particular. It's actually one of my favorites because it's very ambiguous. But today we're looking at the value of empiricism, like kind of firsthand experience and knowledge of the world with this story as background context. So if anybody hasn't read it, no worries. I'm going to briefly summarize the relevant and necessary points. Then we're going to move into the implication and application, empiricism, and how to apply some of these things that we can learn from the story. So the story starts off describing a relationship and a dynamic between a mother and a son. The mother, I believe her name is Vashti, and the son is Kuno. I don't remember the age of the son. It's not particularly important, but the story starts with Kuno calling out to his mother, and he says, "I want to speak with you." And for context, the society that they live in, it's called the Machine. They exist within this machine. So you have to imagine if you were kind of locked in this, like, I don't know, 10 by 10 square of like this little grid, and everything, all of your bodily and intellectual needs, they were immediately met at the press of a button. So you didn't have to do anything. You didn't have to leave your room. You didn't have to go outside. You didn't have to go get your own food. Everything was immediately, provided to you by this machine, hence the title. So obviously, it's described as a dystopian society because people get very codependent on this machine, and they no longer value firsthand direct experience of the world. But Kuno is kind of anomalous. He's kind of posited as this young, rebellious, adventurous spirit. And he calls his mom and he says, "I want to speak with you." And she says, "Yes, we're speaking right now." He says, "No, not through the machine. I want to see you face to face so we can actually, value one another's connection and authentic experience." And she's like, "I don't really see the need to do that. I don't really want to leave my room. There's no need for that. We have this technology. We can speak. If you have something to say, talk to me." And he says, "Mom, I want to see these stars from the surface of the earth," because these little cells are underground again, so they don't experience nature either. So he says, "Mom, I want to experience the stars from the surface of the earth like our ancestors did." And she's like, "You're talking foolishly. This isn't what people do anymore. That's not really our existence anymore. We live in the machine. The machine provides us with everything we need. How could you possibly want anything else?" So that's kind of her stubborn argument. And then he turns around and he says, "Okay, you're not going to speak with me anymore. I refuse to speak with you on the phone anymore. If you want to talk to me, you have to come and see me." So she's like, she's a little frustrated at this. She does want to talk to her son. She does care for him and love him. And she's like, okay, she reluctantly accepts and acquiesces, and she begins to leave her cell. Now, what she does when she opens a door, I don't know if she's ever opened a door in her life in this little cell. She goes to go outside. She looks down in this like hallway, and she's confronted with, quote, the terrors of direct experience. And then she kind of just like hesitates and then immediately turns around and goes back into her cell. And then she eventually talks herself into it. She goes out and she takes this like ship and whatever transportation method they have, and her son is across the world. So this middle of the story is describing Vashti's journey to meet her son, to actually talk to him. And she is so disconnected with the beauty of the natural world that they're flying over, I think the author describes the Himalayas, and like this beautiful eclipse and beautiful sunlight coming through these plane windows, and they fly over Greece and they see all these islands. And she's like, "Oh, close the blinds. I don't want to see any of that. It doesn't give me any ideas. It doesn't bring me any joy. It doesn't bring me any security and satisfaction and safety. I don't like that. So just close the window. I'm already in a state of panic. I don't want to see anything. I don't want to experience anything new or experience anything firsthand." I think it's the most important, dominant narrative for her. So eventually she goes through all of this and she meets Kuno. And now Kuno at this point is telling her about his, I guess, journey to the surface of the earth and how he's in trouble for actually getting caught by doing this. So he is going to be exiled, which is basically being put to death in this new society under the machine's rules, for being an adventurous spirit and trying to experience things firsthand. So he tells his mother of an instance where he eventually somehow escaped the machine. He was walking throughout all these corridors and hallways trying to explore and map out the entire machine in his head. And he eventually found one that led up to the surface of the earth. But although he was born in the machine, so he's conditioned to literally breathe this certain type of air that the machine produces in their vents. So he literally couldn't breathe pure oxygen or pure like air in nature anymore. So he describes how he was kind of circulating around the vent out of the machine, and he was on the surface of the earth exploring all of these things, and how eventually he got caught by this like machine, and he woke up in his room, and he kind of was, I believe the story describes him as like passing out or something from the lack of oxygen or whatever. But he wakes up in his room, and then he knows he's in trouble, basically. His mother is very disappointed. She goes back all the way across around the world to her little cell, and then he ends up calling her, and he says, hey, the machine is going to stop. And then she hears this, and she says, that's nonsense. I don't really know. I've never heard those words before. That doesn't make any sense. I can't imagine a world without all of my needs being met at the press of a button. I'm so subservient to this machine, I can't even imagine a reality without it. So she's just like in complete denial of this. And slowly but surely, the machine does begin to stop. So Vashti notes like small discrepancies in her environment that are kind of dysfunctional. In particular, the music that she has, like she presses a button and gets music, there's like static with it, and she just begins to accept it. Oh, I guess it's just part of the music. I put a ticket in for support. I guess they're just going to fix it. I'm not worried about it. Whatever. It's not a big deal. And then the air starts to, has dysfunction, and she can't breathe properly. And then everything eventually shuts down. And the story ends with everybody just in a state of mass hysteria and mass panic. Everybody's just pushing their doors open. Everybody's running, screaming, running around in circles. They don't know what to do with themselves because they've literally been so conditioned and subservient to exist through this machine as an intermediary device. They've never experienced anything firsthand. So the story ends with them literally all just screaming around and presumably dying from, I would assume, the lack of oxygen or food or whatever, because they don't know how to do these things on their own. But there is a small glimmer of hope. The only, optimistic end interpretation of the story is that when Kuno was on the surface of Earth, he actually saw this like little breakaway civilization, if you will, on the surface of the Earth, which he does remember. And like he wanted humanity to move back toward nature, to reconcile with that natural form of living with direct experience, and to get away from this secondhand experience, as his mother was kind of stuck into. So that's how the story ends. Everybody kind of dies tragically, but there is a glimmer of hope for humanity is reconciling again with nature, I would say. So there's a lot of room for interpretation here. We can look at the polarity between Kuno and his mother. We can look at the polarity between the surface of the earth and nature, or the security of the machine and subservience. But what I'm going to do is look at it through the lens of empiricism. So empiricism is basically valuing knowledge that you've received from firsthand impression of the world. So empiricism would be like not relying on me telling you what a movie is like. It's like you watching that movie yourself. It's saying, okay, I can form my own intrinsic value judgments off of what I've seen from my direct sense impressions of the movie, or of this experience, or of this life. So that's the value. And that's something that Kuno held very dear to his core fundamental philosophy, I would say. And by contrast, everybody who existed in the machine valued a lack of empiricism. They valued everything secondhand, or even 10th hand, which we're going to get to a quote from the book in a second. But on this idea of empiricism, I have a quote from Nietzsche in his autobiography, Ecce Homo, where he says, ultimately, no one can hear in things, books included, more than he already knows. If you have no access to something from experience, you will have no ear for it. So if you guys were just on the call before this presentation started, I was just talking with Shrikant about this. The optimal way to learn is actually to connect a new piece of information, a new body of data, with the already established set of experiences that you have in the world. And I think it makes a lot of sense when we put things in metaphors, and we put things in metaphors for a reason, because it makes it conducive to our experiences and our individual lifetimes, because every individual is unique in the sense of nobody is going to look at the same thing and get the identical interpretation of that thing. So that's the beauty and the necessity of individuality, and avoiding groupthink, avoiding all of these things, avoiding mindlessly accepting what an outside and exterior force would feed us, in this case, the machine. So the direct quote that I have that encapsulates this dichotomy from the story itself is from, it's not from Vashti, but she's describing a situation where she's talking with her friends over this like video communication thing. Ironic, we're doing that right now. But she says, beware of firsthand ideas, exclaimed one of the most advanced of them, most advanced lecturers, most advanced intellectuals of this society in the machine. Beware of firsthand ideas. First-hand ideas do not really exist. They are but the physical impressions produced by love and fear. And on this gross foundation, who could establish a philosophy? Let your ideas be second-hand, and if possible, 10th hand. Then they will be far removed from that disturbing element, direct observation. So this is going back to the point in the story where Vashti first had the inclination and impulse to walk outside of her door, and then she was seized with the terrors of direct experience. So she doesn't know how to deal with anything unless it's through somebody else's methods, which is extremely dangerous and extremely debilitating and weakening, which is why they all died at the end, of course. So there's a congruent philosophy that I espoused from a book. It's actually called The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. And she kind of describes this whole fiction. I'm not going to explain the entire story, but there's a quote in that book where it kind of describes this dichotomy between first-hand experience and second-hand. And she says, nothing is given to man on earth. Everything he needs has to be produced. And here man faces his basic alternative. This is the dichotomy between Kuno and Vashti. He can survive in only one of two ways: by the independent work of his own mind, Kuno, or as a parasite fed by the minds of others, Vashti. The creator originates, the parasite borrows. The creator faces nature alone. Literally, Kuno did that alone. The parasite faces nature through an intermediary, and verbatim, intermediary, that's exactly what the word was used in The Machine Stops. Everything was an intermediary. You didn't have to access anything directly. Everything was provided to you by either other people or the machine itself. The creator's concern is the conquest of nature. The parasite's concern is the conquest of men. So you can also look at this as like all of these individuals in the society of the machine, they are not exercising their most fundamental capacity of a human being, and that is creative imagination. I believe that it's the most beautiful and meaningful faculty that we have access to as individuals, as humans. I think that's the only thing that sets us apart from base level organisms such as apes and other primitive beings, is creative imagination. We can create something in our mind. You look at everything around you, you look at the clothes that you're wearing, you look at the phone that you're watching this on, or the laptop. Everybody created that first in the realm of their imagination, and they took subsequent necessary action to manifest that into a tangible reality. So literally everything around us was created in thought first. And in this machine society, nobody would be creative. Everybody is critiquing. Everybody is constantly playing the contrarian or the devil's advocate, which is, I mean, to be blatant, I would say intellectually indolent. It's lazy. It's not creating anything. It's just somebody espousing a theory. It's taking this, it's taking a book of philosophy and saying, I don't like that. I disagree. I disagree. I disagree. You're just chopping it down, and you're not proliferating anything of your own value because you have none of your own unique experiences, because you are identical to every single other individual in this machine. So in this machine society, I wouldn't even look at them as humans. I would look at those people as relegated to a more primitive form of anthropomorphic existence, because there's no differentiation between the constituents of the species. So the next point that I want to talk about is that empiricism itself, like embodying the ideas and philosophies of Kuno, can lead to motivation and fulfillment in itself. I watched a TED Talk several years ago. It was by this individual named Daniel Pink, and he's talking about, I think the TED Talk is titled The Surprising Science Behind Motivation. And he looked at a bunch of studies, a bunch of statistics, a bunch of articles and research on what makes people motivated in like their career, which is probably the most primary force of where their allocation of their time goes. So he took that, okay, career. What makes people really succeed, really go far, really, work harder when other people kind of just don't? And he boiled it down and consolidated his research into three things. And they were autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And I think the most important one would be here, and most relevant and pertinent to the story and the individual Kuno, I would say, is autonomy, being governed by self, not being externally controlled by any other mechanism or individual or hierarchy or society or expectation, etc. So autonomy, mastery, and purpose. I always thought that always stuck with me since I heard those things. I think we should always strive to do that. And we're going to get to that in the application portion of this. And a final point here for the implication. There's a quote I've always loved by the Russian novelist Dostoevsky. He said, "It's better to go wrong in your own way than to go right in somebody else's way." Now, you can take this quote to the extreme. Obviously, I think there are, of course, exceptions. We should learn from other people who've done similar things that we want to do. We can take that into account. but ultimately we have to take action ourselves. We have to face nature without an intermediary agent, as it says in the Fountainhead. We have to face this thing with direct experience, because we are not relegated to a machine. Every single person in the species of humanity has an individual life experience and life trajectory and life pathway, and no two are identical. So if you look at that, even a purely reductionist argument, everybody is going to experience some unique set of perspectives and experiences and circumstances that has never been repeated in that succession from the origin of civilization. Okay, nobody. You can take bits and pieces and say, I want to be a prolific architect, so I'm going to study architects. That's fine, but you're not just relegated to be defined by an architect. You also have a family, you also have friendships, you also have your personality, you have your temperament, you have all these other attributes that define you outside of your career. So with that said, the encapsulation and amalgamation of all that, you still have to go through direct experiences by yourself that nobody has the answers for. So that's part of what Dostoevsky means by it's better to go wrong in your own way, because you're always going to come across circumstances and events in some chain that is in some algorithm unique across all individual members. So at this point, I want to move into the application, the third part of this discussion, how we are to apply these ideas, what we can learn from Kuno, what we can learn from these other quotes and ideas from Dostoevsky and Ayn Rand and Nietzsche, etc. And I think the first is obviously the most blatant one in Kuno's philosophy and attributes, and that is courage. And that is courage to go against the grain and pursue something that you see valuable, even if it's uncharted, or even if you have a bunch of contravening agents fighting against you, even if you are discouraged by other people not to do that, okay? If you feel the impulse to do something, I do believe wholeheartedly you should do this. For Mark Twain has a famous quote, by the end of your life, you're going to regret more of what you didn't do than more of what you did. So I would say, like, experience whatever you would want to experience, shoot your shot, whatever you wanted to do, you have an impulse, you should go actualize on it, and you shouldn't really place that much value on external validation of your choices. Okay. I think people place higher value on other opinions when they don't have a true desire to do that thing in themselves. If you have a strong enough desire to actualize a certain end, all you need is your validation. All you need is your own opinion on what you should do to get to this end result. And you're not going to say, hey, I want to start my own business. What do you think? What does my neighbor think? What does my brother think? What does my coworker think? That's all irrelevant. That's all irrelevant, especially if they haven't done the thing that you want or have the results that you want to emulate, especially in that part. So I think that the main theme here would be courage. So we should adopt courage. And it makes me think of the classic fable and allegory of Plato's cave, right? The individual, he had the impulse to discover the fundamental nature of reality. He had a sneaking suspicion that there was a differentiation between what he was being presented with and the actual core reality in the world. So he had that inclination and he went on to pursue that, even though he eventually led with supreme opposition with the other constituents of the cave, with the other members of the cave. So Kuno and the member in Plato's cave both exhibited profound courage. So I would say that's one interpretation, that's one application we can do. Another thing is kind of related to what I was just talking about, is kind of ignore the common opinion, ignore external validation. There's a quote I've always loved. This is by Henry Ford. He says, if I asked people, he's obviously the founder of the Ford automobile company. He says, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have told me they wanted faster horses. Okay. So he didn't acknowledge that he built a car, because he said, I'm not operating on that plane of external validation, of asking people what they would expect of me. I'm operating on my own plane. I want to achieve this thing. I don't need any other external validation. I have my own internal validation. I have a burning desire to actualize and manifest this dream into reality. Therefore, I'm going to pursue that regardless. And that's what he did multiple times, actually. Not only with the car itself, but also the V8 motor as well. Similar story there. So another idea we have is value strength over safety. So regardless, you're going to like, you can look at suffering, you can look at obstacles, you can look at challenges, you can look at uncomfortable circumstances and situations as ineluctable. They are inescapable in every single human life. You're going to come across obstacles. You're going to be exploited. You're going to be betrayed. You're going to be laughed at. You're going to be embarrassed. Even on a more, I guess, like dark way, you can look at everybody in your life. You're going to eventually lose. Everybody's going to eventually get sick. You're going to deal with death. You're going to deal with loss. So what can we do in light of these things? And I think going back to the story of the machine stops, we can look at this through two potential interpretations. We can be like Vashti and shield ourselves from the, I guess, dangerous or undesirable manifestations of reality. But in doing so, we would get weaker. Or we can be like Kuno, we can face these things head on, and we can deal with this opposition. And then through this opposition, we begin to get stronger. And just as Nietzsche says, in the mountains of truth, you can never climb in vain, for you either reach a summit or you have higher capacity to climb tomorrow. So I think it's a very constructive attitude to have toward life's attenuating forces. Another idea for an application would be, whenever possible, within reason, we should seek unbiased sources in our acquisition of knowledge. So this is contravening against Vashti's idea of seeking 10th hand experience of the world. So instead of like looking at, I mean, like I said, within reason, because there are time constraints, there could be utility in looking at like summaries of great works of literature. If you don't have the time, there could be utility in watching a YouTube video on a philosopher. If you don't have the time to read hundreds of pages of him, if you don't understand, there could be utility in that. But you should seek unbiased sources as much as possible. And again, that's a whole different topic on how we should do that in itself, we might get into later. And third, another point that I have three more, sorry. Another point is back to Daniel Pink's The Science of Motivation, is to heighten our emphasis on what we value in terms of autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So we should be engaged in a craft, in a career, in a profession, in a job, in an industry, in a position that is going to allow us to plug in those three attributes: autonomy, being self-governed, so having some control over your promotion, having some control over your income. I know a lot of people in sales really heighten the value of commission, for example, because that's complete autonomy, right? But the downside, they don't really have security. But I think it's personally a valuable exchange. And then the second one is mastery, continual adaptation, continually getting better, continually improving your craft. If you're interested in your industry, continually asking yourself, what can I do to be a better accountant, lawyer, mother, father, whatever role that you play in your world? What can you do to continually be better? Because if you're not getting better, you're getting worse. There's no such thing as stagnation. And then purpose, linking your actions to a meaningful end, making these things emotionally motivating. And this reminds me of the classic Nietzsche idea, where he says a person who has a why will be able to bear any how. And the last 2 points I have is, first is to prioritize novel experiences. So this is related to the I guess, natural succession of what would happen when you have firsthand experience of the world. And to do this, an example, I mean, it's kind of cliche, but you can make some sort of a bucket list, people call it, like things you've always wanted to do, or things you've always wanted to experience, things that you were always particularly curious about, or things that you espoused that you wanted to do, but you were discouraged from your friends or your parents or society, or you feel guilty, or it's taboo, or you don't feel like you are apt enough. You feel like you're inept and you're not talented enough to try a new sport or something like that. You should always, again, going back to the quote from Mark Twain, you're going to regret more of what you didn't do by the end of your life than what you did do. So I would say prioritize novel experiences, because this will heighten and amplify the perception we have of time. I'll give you a practical example. If you've ever been on a vacation, okay, well, even if it was like 2 days or a week or 2 weeks, I guarantee you remember so much from that vacation, from those 2 days of vacation, rather than a typical Monday and Tuesday from any typical like routine in your daily life. And that is largely because all these sensory stimuli on this vacation is novel. It's direct experience. It's brand new. You have to process so much, and your scope and your perception of time is going to dilate. And that's why years later, you're going to remember those events on those 1 or 2 days over these monotonous, habitual routines that we tend to get stuck into and relegated out of valuing safety over adventure, and out of valuing, I guess, like monotony over novelty. So with that said, I'm going to pass it to Shrikant. He's going to moderate for some Q&A, and we're going to move into some breakout groups.
All right, folks, so it's time for Q&A. Rules as usual, type exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom in order to line up to ask questions. Keep on topic, be brief, and be courteous. First up is Joe. Joe, go ahead. Just a second, let me go ahead and change the settings here. Yes, go ahead, Joe.
Hey, John, thanks for tonight's presentation. Fantastic as always. You know, there's so many facets to this. It's like isolation. There's so many different ways you could go about it. I haven't had a chance to read it, but I look forward to reading it. One of the things that I took away from it, what you were just talking about, is innovation as a skill. So my first question is, are firsthand experiences needed or essential for innovation? And my second one is, does the dependence on the machine remove expectations, which doesn't allow us to manufacture purpose? So essentially, our complete dependence on this machine takes away purpose in our world, so which essentially leads to, sounds like, the destruction. And thank you again.
Absolutely. So yes, novel experiences. I do think this is a necessary predecessor to innovation. I do absolutely think so. Or at least as close as we can get to direct experience. So maybe it's only secondhand if it's like, I don't know, your boss telling you something or somebody that has studied. I mean, in a sense, you can argue every single book is secondhand experience of the world, right? Like if I read Shakespeare, or if I read Plato, or if I like, that's their account of their thoughts and I'm kind of reading that. So you can argue that's not direct experience, but like that's kind of, it's as close as I can get to the source, right? So I think it is necessary for innovation because you're going to come against all of these unprecedented and unexpected variables in terms of like, you're bringing you into the equation. So it's not just like, okay, this individual had this experience with that trajectory or that journey, and yours is not going to be identical because you and that person have so many discrepancies between you two. And even if they're not explainable, even if they're not tangible, if they're in terms of temperament, if they're in terms of things that you don't know that are even inside of you until you come across these obstacles or you come across this journey, and then you discover a part of yourself from that external journey as a tool, if that makes sense. So it's a tool to illuminate your own character and your own idiosyncrasies and your own attributes back to you. And I think that would lead to innovation. And the second point, I do agree, the machine would circumvent any purpose because there was no individuality. And this makes me think of the Immortal from Borges again, where there's no differentiation between any members of the group. Like every human is identical. They're not attached to anything larger than themselves. I mean, literally they are with the machine, but in terms of like the connecting their actions to serving an end, like they're not working toward anything. They're literally distracting themselves to death. That's literally what these people are doing in the machine. They're listening to music, they're watching TV, they're doing these things. They're not creating anything. They're not solving any problems for their fellow man. They're doing nothing. They're literally distracting themselves to death. And in that, in escapism, in distraction, I would not see any purpose.
So let me go ahead and ask a question. As there is no question, let me just jump in very quickly before anybody lines up. So it's clear that we can learn a lot of things from other people. And it's clear that we have to kind of ground things ourselves. So one of the ways in which I like to think about it is the question of, is the concept of map and territory. What you're trying to see is territory. You know, your commitment is to understand the territory. Now you have to form a map in order to do that, and so does everybody else. Now, if you substitute other people's maps and confuse that for territory, that is being second-hand or third-hand, fourth-hand. If you use somebody's map in order to look at the territory that it may be pointing to, your focus is still on territory, and that's still first-hand. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Next up is Laura. Laura, go ahead. Laura, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, actually, I was going to bring up that point about it's never just a solitary individual, that you're interacting all the time, and there's those influences, you know, come. So you're really, it's never just you. It's never just pure you, and it can't be just a pure you at this. I agree. You have to have innovation and you're always building on something. It's your individual idea based on somebody else's point. So your start point is based on somebody else's creation, idea, innovation. You're taking it somewhere else. So it is new and it's individual because it's beyond that point. So, but it has been based on somebody else's work. And you can say that it's not individual and it's not an individual idea or unique idea, but it is or it isn't. It depends how you look at it, but I don't think you can just look at things individually.
Right. I do see what you're saying. I mean, that's kind of the point I was alluding to when I talked about like reading books. I mean, even this right now, like I just gave you guys my summary of the book, right? I mean, even that. But I think in terms of like where you take the information and if there is risk involved for you in particular. So if you're shielding yourself as these people are doing in the machines, there's no risk, there's no potential loss. I mean, yes, I do agree with you in terms of like, you're not going to individually create everything. Like I'm not going to go explore and discover calculus like Newton did. Okay, I'm not going to do that. Okay, he made this theory. He has these mathematics. He has these theoretical propositions. I'm going to take those. You know, I'm going to use them. Same thing with all these philosophers. Same thing with these scientists and these researchers. I'm not going to, you know, grow all of my own food. Right? That would be first experience to the literal sense. I'm talking about like in terms of like what you're going to take it, like where you're going to take it. There's a quote, I forget who said it, but he says, it doesn't matter where you take things from, it matters where you take them to. So I think that's very thought-provoking.
Excellent. So it's going to be Sanjay, Shelley, let me see, Sanjay, Shelley, Mike, Chachi, and Jean next. Sanjay, go ahead. You can ask one or two questions, but just keep them brief.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so first, the question I'm asking is, I mean, I have my own idea about it, but I want to hear you and maybe other people. So I was thinking, what really constitutes the essence of this machine? Because, you know, the machine is complex, but it's more than just a machine. It's actually, you know, the whole entire world, it's much more than that. But what's the essence, the one object that you think constitutes a machine? Or another way to say it is, what made everybody behave in the way that they did and treat the machine in the way that they treated it?
So that's actually part of the breakout room questions. Like what's the prominent governing variable behind 10th hand experience, which is a machine? I think it's safety. I think it's fear of the unknown. I think it's fear of exploring new things. I think it's fear of coming across criticism or obstacles. I think it's fear. So if you polarize that, what the machine is providing is security or certainty, you can argue, or expediency maybe.
Okay, thank you. Another question, second question is, so the machine stopped and basically Kuno, we can say predicted it, but I suspect that Kuno is the one who actually precipitated the stoppage or the destruction of the machine. What are your thoughts on that?
I actually agree with that. I do. That's why I love this work so much, because there's a big gap in that. You know what I mean? In his conversation with his mother, the machine stops. It just flips to her perspective and like the gradual deterioration and dysfunction of all these methodologies of the machine, and then it links up back with Kuno in the end. I mean, and their dialogue, their exchange is very short. I actually agree with that, though. I do. I like that.
So next up is Shelley. So it's going to be Shelley, Mike, Chachi, Jean, Dave, and Leslie. Shelley, go ahead.
Thanks. So John, thank you for picking this book. It's so fascinating. And it reminded me so much of Brave New World, which has been one of my top 5 books for probably 30 years or so. And I didn't realize that on YouTube, they have audiobooks. Like that's where I found it on YouTube, and it was read to me, which I thought was super cool earlier today. But I think Sanjay visited 2 points or questions I had. One was I wanted to know what your thoughts were on the theme of fear, because I think that was the overriding theme of the whole machine, the creation of it, and what kept people like buying into it, right? Their need for security and safety and their fear. And then I did not clue into that the sun was the means behind the machine stopping. Like, I wondered what caused that. Like, I didn't clue into that. So anyway, any thoughts on either of those would be awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, so absolutely fear was the dominating narrative behind this. And I think it's accurately expressed in the quote where Vashti was seized with the terrors of direct experience. So terrors, obviously fear, underlying fear. And I think to polarize that, the only thing they would want was a life with no fear. And I think this is absolutely personally reprehensible, because when you look at, I think there's commonly a misconception with courage. Courage isn't the absence of fear; it's acting in spite of it, anyways. Like, it's not, like, there's this misconception: brave people, or like people who do these novel things all of the time, they always still feel fear, but they just act in spite of it. And I have actually tried to condition myself personally in my life, when I feel these emotions, such as fear, such as worry, such as doubt, such as indecision, such as like questioning myself and my abilities. That to me is a psychological indicator that I am on the confines of the edge of my comfort zone, right? Or I'm in uncertain territory, or I'm in room for optimal growth. And with that intellectual information in mind, I push myself forward regardless, or at least I always try to. And this has obviously coincided with a lot of other philosophy that I've had, and we've talked about in the past, Dante's Inferno in particular, the 5-second rule, other things like that. But yeah, the whole narrative behind everybody in the machine, they succumbed to their fear. Their fear was greater than their capacity, and their fear was greater than their faith in themselves to become strong in the face of fear.
Next up is Mike.
I just wonder to what extent there are parallels to our current economic situation. The machine stopped when we learned about COVID, and how the political and sociological things leave room for those kinds of things. You also brought in Ayn Rand as to what happened when Wesley Mooch became president of the United States. And I wonder if some of those things have parallels, or am I imagining more than is in the book?
No, not at all. I think there are absolutely parallels. I don't think you're stretching imagination by any means here. I do see like utility in the state of somebody or you can even look at this in terms of like being so codependent on a parent, right? A kid being so codependent on a parent that when they become of age, they just don't get a job, and they just become, I guess, like, to use Rand's words, a parasite, if you will. And I think when you become too dependent on something, it can yield to subservience, or it can yield to lack of character development, or you might not know how to act once that thing is gone. So you shouldn't really, maybe as an application from using that for economical standpoint, maybe we should look at ourselves and say, hey, if a fundamental Stoic mantra, I forget the Latin phrase they use for it, or the Greek phrase they use for it, but like, prepare for the worst. So ask yourself, okay, would I be okay if I lost my job? Would I be okay if my partner left me? What would I do? Like, obviously you're not expecting these things to happen, but it could serve psychological utility for a thought experiment and development of character to ask yourself, what would I do in this situation? Or, I mean, if you don't, maybe some things you can't conceptualize, maybe some things might happen that you can't imagine. You should have faith in yourself that, okay, regardless, I'm going to cultivate my capacity for independence, and I'm going to have faith in myself that no matter what life throws at me, or whatever happens in my external circumstances, I still have that rock solid foundation in my beliefs of myself.
Next up is Chachi. Chachi, go ahead.
I have kind of a weird thing I'm going to throw out, but it's based on the quotes that you were saying about first-hand ideas not really existing, and what the machine is essentially doing when it stops. It's like, is it stopping because it runs out of problems to solve in a growth mode and turns into like its own devil's advocate, and then starts like attacking itself? Like, it could self-destruct if it started to just kind of like turn on itself, because, do you know what I mean? Like, to see the end of its own demise. Or is this something like where we think there's like maybe human intervention, like from Kuno or someone else that said this is just an unsustainable model? I mean, I didn't really understand like the ultimate demise and how that perpetuated itself.
Yeah, I mean, like I was talking with Sanjay about there's a lot of ambiguity. You know, they don't really explain who maintains this machine, who upkeeps its optimal functioning, and all these things. So I think there is a lot of ambiguity, and I think I agree with Sanjay because of the fact that Kuno was this like rebellious, kind of adventurous spirit that couldn't be relegated to the confines of the physical machine, right? He was just like, his soul had so much unrest in it because he was existing in an identical room to his mother. But you had the option to leave. You could travel around to other rooms. I mean, all the other rooms are identical. So Vashti's argument was like, why travel in the first place, right? But he was just very curious. He was walking all around the corridors, and he eventually got to the surface of the earth, and he saw that little breakaway civilization. So he's like, okay, I understand living without the machine as a possibility because these people are doing it. I'm thinking about things that our ancestors must have done in the past, like live in nature, because that's what these people are doing. And he begins to entertain all these theories, and then he eventually gets to the surface of the earth by himself. And then he explores it a little bit. You know, he's going back and forth to the little air vent so he can actually breathe the machine's air because he's been indoctrinated to it for literally physical survival. So he's going back and forth, but with each, I guess, inhalation of breath, he's exploring a little bit more, you know what I mean? And I think that's the human spirit personified. I think that's Kuno is a representative of the spirit. He is a vessel for the spirit. And I guess Vashti would be a prison for the spirit. But yeah, so I just personally like to entertain that idea that Kuno perpetuated and was the catalyst for its downfall, because it makes sense for me, because he was a philosophical and adventurous type, and he can extrapolate the future of humanity with being non-conducive to this machine. This machine was a huge parasite for the soul, I would say.
Next up is Jean. So it's going to be Jean, Dave, Leslie, Paul, Kylie, and Jackie next. Jean, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for presenting this book. It sounds very fascinating. Because I think I really worried about, I think this kind of prediction of the future, what we are in right now, because I see my kids have the education. Mostly they teach secondhand experience, because my son is complaining. He loves science, but he doesn't like the science he's taking right now. It's all about reading articles and writing. And they don't even do the experiment of observing. And I found my older kids in high school, and they have no interest in nature. I take them to Glacier Park, I take them to National Park, and they have not interest at all. You know, so they're just fascinated by internet. So I really think this book is a good warning for everybody. I have a question is about firsthand experience. I think, you know, there's a Chinese saying, you travel thousands of miles and you read thousands of books. I think you read thousands of books is second-hand experience. And you travel thousands of miles is first-hand experience. I think it needs to be integrated because, like Jordan Peterson mentioned, we first have to set up the system of our thinking process, which mostly through philosophy, through other things. Then when we have this system, then we can actually have better or efficiently experience the first-hand experience. So I think it's really integrated in some way. And I think it's more not just about first-hand experience, it's more about independent thinking. You know, you can learn any knowledge, but you have to go through yourself, create your own process to make your own understanding. I think that's more critical than just first-hand experience. You know, I think that's make this guy question about, so you don't take everything for granted, you make your own judgment, use your first-hand and second-hand experience and make your own judgment. So everybody if can do that independent thinking, then we don't have group think. We don't end up like the people there. You know, I think that's kind of my understanding.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very useful and constructive clarification. Like in the capacity for independent thought, I do look at that as a necessary precursor, because somebody can have direct experience, the same direct experience 10 times in a row and never learn from it if they don't have independent thought, right? So it is a necessary precursor, I think. So absolutely, yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you, Jane. That was great. You know, kind of saying that it is not really about first-hand experience, but first-hand judgment versus second-hand or 10th-hand judgment. So it's like judgment has to be yours. You have to decide whether it is true. Next up is Dave. Dave, go ahead.
Thanks, Shrikant. John, thanks for bringing a very interesting story to us. what came to my mind was utopia, that this was someone's utopian idea, you know, that all their needs would be met, even though it was in this 10 by 10 cubicle or whatever. And it kind of meant to me that one man's utopia is another man's nightmare, that I have to live my own life and not somebody else's. Thanks again.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I do agree with that. There's a congruent line of thinking along the philosophy of Dostoevsky in Notes from Underground. If you've read that, he has a beautiful, this is actually kind of parallel to the spirit of Kuno, I would say. He has a beautiful critique of utopia in that book. That's a famous man is a man and not a piano key quote in Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. So if you're interested in that line of thinking, I would recommend that.
Next up is Leslie. Leslie, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. When you were describing the machine, it made me think of an unborn baby who's in a confined space with almost no variation, and all its needs are met even before the needs arise. It's a perfect temperature, it's comfortable, it's never hungry. And that when the baby's born and all of a sudden those needs aren't perfectly met, the kid cries and has a meltdown for years until he can learn how to talk and think. I mean, I'm exaggerating slightly, but that's very much the reaction that it sounds like people in the story had when this, effectively a womb, when they were cast out of this womb, they were as functional as a newborn baby. And then I had another thought about, and I think it's connected to experiences and independent thought, but people don't often know when they're trapped. They don't know there's any other way to be, any other way to live, any other way to think. They only, it sounded like in the story, people were choosing the security and the certainty to protect themselves from fear. But I think so many people in life have no idea that anything exists beyond where they were born and what they've seen and experienced. So either of those two thoughts, do people even know they're trapped, or is the machine a lot like being in a womb? Either idea.
Well, to your first metaphor, with you just put like a really funny image in my head of like literally screaming infants running around out of their cell doors. But I mean, it's a perfect analogy. It's a perfect metaphor. Like literally their needs are met before they even know what they need, and then they get out and then they're terrified. You know what I mean? Every baby is born hysterically crying because it's such a new blast of new direct experience for the world that they don't know how to interpret. They don't know how to cognitively process. So first of all, excellent metaphor. And I do completely, I do, what was the second point?
The idea that people don't even know they're trapped.
Right,
they don't even know they should look elsewhere.
Right, I do agree. And that's kind of encapsulated, addressing that point is encapsulated in valuing novelty and valuing adventure over security. For if we do these things, we're going to come across these. I was giving this in an answer to Joe about using the external world as kind of a tool to illuminate your character. So you're going to come across challenges, you're going to come across obstacles, you're going to come across, even if it's not a challenge, even if it's just a new perspective on the already established set of information that you do have. So I think this is the value of intellectual diversity, of getting around people who have different cultural upbringings, have different backgrounds, who have differing views on things, and that can illuminate our habitual, monotonous, stuck patterns that we exist in. All of us exist in patterns somewhere. We don't intellectually understand all of them. And there's a quote, I forget who it's by, but he says, we're all think the same, none think very much. So I do think there is value in seeing new things, seeing things from new perspectives, and that will illuminate, hopefully, the areas that we are stuck in.
Thank you. Next up is Paul. Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thanks again, everyone. This is always great. I never dreamed I'd be spending Friday nights on Zoom. And,
right.
But it's part of my point, which is, John, how much do you think, related to a previous question someone pointed out about her kids losing interest, that we already have a living experiment of the machine? Here I am, I can order anything I want. I never have to leave my house. I can have temperature control. I can talk to Alexa. Alexa might even someday be able to understand my mood. How much are we in a living real world test of what the machine does because we have it? forming in our own world right now with the internet and accentuated by COVID. So that's my question.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, I do definitely see parallels, especially in like younger generations. People are literally glued to their phones. And I think there's always the option to succumb to those influences. I mean, they are tempting, right, to have something immediately met, but it could be, I actually did this, I had an experiment the other week with a friend. We had, actually, it wasn't the other week, it was before COVID. We had an experiment. We wanted to figure something out. And then instead of like literally Googling like you would do now, we went through this process of like exploration. So what we did is we went to the library, like a lot of older people probably just did in general. I've never had to experience though. We went to a library and we looked at like 7 or 8 books trying to find something in particular, like a very random fact. Like I forget, it was so trivial, I forget what the fact was, but just to have that direct experience like we're talking about and not have this expedient, okay, Google, tell me what this is. Okay, I didn't have to invest anything in that, so I'm not even gonna pay attention to the outcome. I do think that that possibility is always there, and it is tempting to have all of our needs met instantaneously. But I've been personally in my own life trying to value firsthand experience more, trying to value investing into things so I can, even unnecessarily investing into them, so I can reap the reward and value the outcome a lot higher than I would if I didn't do anything, or if I got it from 10th hand application, from technology or from other people, etc. So every now and then I try to check myself and kind of detach from technology and detach from 10th hand experience and do my best to experience it directly and then judge it independently.
Next up is Kylie. Kylie, go ahead.
Good afternoon or evening. But my question is kind of like a 3-part question. The first part was, if you could control the outcome of the story, how would you have untethered the dependency on the machine? Because we're talking a lot about how it's already there, but how would you go about like, you know?
So Kylie, go ahead and ask all your 3 questions, and then he can deal with whichever ones he wants.
And the second one is, do you think it would have been even worth time or investment to have gone through the effort of limiting the people's dependency? Because it would require a process, but would the process be worth the outcome? And then the last one is, how does parasitic dependency impact someone's worth as a person, in your opinion?
Okay, so those are very deep questions. Thank you. So the first one, I think there is a lot of variables in terms of temperament, in terms of like how people can perceive truth. One of my favorite quotes is from Beyond Good and Evil, where Nietzsche says, the strength of a person's spirit is measured by how much truth he can tolerate. More precisely, to what extent he needs to have that truth diluted, sweetened, muted, and falsified. So in other words, a supremely, I guess, somebody with a high capacity and strength in their spirit can deal with a lot of truth at once, can deal with a lot of illusions that they rely on and that they exist in being destroyed at once. They have that capacity. Now, is there a fundamental baseline where we can argue a particular set of people or a particular just society in general or human in general? Can they tolerate this much truth? I think there is an upper limit to that, because Nietzsche also has an upper limit where he says we have art in order to not perish from the truth. So there, he does point to and allude to there is a capacity, there's an upward limit to the amount of truth we can tolerate, at least at once, right? At least in one go, right? Like ripping off the Band-Aid. So that's a very good question. I do think it depends on temperament, however. Maybe not ripping off the Band-Aid was such a good, I would say, approach if Kuno did it, because everybody died, right? And it's like, there could have been valuable people there that died. There could have been people who had the capacity for adventure. They just didn't know any better, right? They were indoctrinated. They were conditioned. And maybe if they learned, or maybe if they saw the natural world, they would have became these strong, competent people of value. So I don't think that might have necessarily been the best approach. Although I do typically intrinsically favor more truth than less truth, like a drop down effect, like drippling. But I mean, there's a lot of context and nuance in terms of like how it fell apart, because in this story, we only got Vashti's perspective, right? We only got her perspective of like the machine gradually breaking down, which it was gradually breaking down. First the music went, and then like something with the air went, and then the water went. but she was so subservient, she couldn't accept any of it, right? She was just like, oh, it'll be taken care of. Not like, oh, wait, maybe my son was right about the machine stopping. Maybe I should prepare myself. She didn't do any of that. So she was very weak, I would say. So it was kind of gradual, but I mean, the story, like I said, it's ambiguous. They don't really say, oh, the water wasn't working for a month. This wasn't working for 2 weeks. You know what I mean? But I do think a gradual stair step, like de-evolution from that, would be the most effective approach personally. But I think it varies in temperament. So that's the first point. And then the other point, I would say, like being parasitic in terms of if you're parasitic, or if you're 10th hand, like dependent on somebody else or some other intermediary agent, if you're ignorant of it, I wouldn't impose any moral judgment on the character. But if somebody is knowledgeable and they are cognizant of the fact that, okay, I'm either voluntarily or involuntarily succumbing to my fear, I'm not exposing myself to the fears of direct experiences, I'm not being courageous, I'm not being brave, I'm not being bold, I'm not lightening the burdens and responsibility of other people, that I'm forcing them to adopt more responsibility for taking care of me. If they're cognizant of that, I would say that's weakness, if they don't voluntarily expose themselves to that firsthand experience. Whereas if they were completely, I would say, ignorant of it, and they didn't know any better, that might be a little bit different. You know what I mean? You can't really impose a moral judgment on them because they simply don't know any better. And the best option in that case would be to kindly educate them, of course, on that situation. But yeah, thank you. Those are actually very, very thought-provoking questions. I'm going to think about the first question actually a lot more now that I want to read the story again with that. So thank you.
Next up is Jackie, Mark, and Jenny. And then we'll do the breakout rooms. Jackie, go ahead.
Sure. Hi. Paul and Jean touched upon my thoughts. I certainly was thinking about social media and things that were coming up. I guess, so I think my question for you is, other than I think now that's obvious that we can put maybe social media or computers maybe in this kind of, I guess my question is really more about, have you given much thought to what I would call modern day machine? What would you say now is the machine? What are the machines? Have you thought about that? What are the machines these days? I mean, the social media was one obvious.
I would say valuing external opinion over internal affirmation. So being more concerned with how somebody sees you or how somebody values you more than you have about yourself.
So it's more of a mental construct, not necessarily, you don't have it as an outside.
Yeah, right. Social media is just a tool to express that.
Okay.
Next up is Mark.
Thank you. Just a few points. I do agree with the theme that seeking nothing but safety and comfort is dangerous, and I think this story does address some of that. But this conversation about the Kuno caused the failure of the machine, I find that very suspect. I don't recall any evidence for this in the story at all. And if we're talking about empiricism, I would expect we would have some. Maybe I'm misremembering it, but that doesn't make sense to me. A much simpler explanation is just the fact that entropy acts on machines fail, and if the society has lost the skill to run the machine, we're in trouble. Engineers are gone. How would Kuno even know how to sabotage the machine? But that's not really I have two questions. That's not really my question. My question is what about the ethics of that? That's completely unethical. It's completely unnecessary. All he's causing is pain and death and destruction. He shouldn't be deciding such things for others, especially when he can just go join those on the surface. So I wonder what you think about the ethics of that action if he truly did commit that act. And then as to the theme of the story, I take away from it, thinking about the time of writing, Forster wrote this, as I believe, as a reaction to H.G. Wells' Time Machine. And his major theme was the fear of becoming too dependent on machines, which I think that's what he's mainly focused on. Don't become dependent on the machines. Maintain the skills so we control the machine rather than the machine controlling us. And I wondered what you thought about that perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. First, I didn't know it was I haven't read Wells. I'm actually going to read that if it was well, I'll read it regardless, but it sounds like it would be if you look at it through that lens, I could definitely see his value in terms of like not being reliant on the machine, but you could still maybe people can still use it, right? Maybe they can travel to the surface of the earth, live on the surface of the earth, and maybe like the machine would be a spa for them. Like you don't have to do anything, because that's kind of our contemporary application of like spas or like a vacation. We don't do anything. We have people to bring us drinks. We have people to bring us food. We have chefs. We have waiters, etc. Rich people have butlers, right? So you can look at a contemporary application of that as being maybe desirable, but you're not going to be lenient on that. You're not going to inherently rely on that. I do see the utility in that argument. And as to the ethical, you know, I do agree with you. It would be, I think it could be looked at as morally corrupt, but I also do see kind of this seed in like being a martyr in, not a martyr. I don't think it's the right word. Cause he didn't really, actually he did sacrifice himself, cause he did die, I believe, at the end as well. And he died with his mother, I believe, like having a conversation. But I mean, yeah, you're right. Who's to say that is a very morally, thought-provoking question. Who's to say he has the right, if you will, to pull the plug on the machine if he did it? Yeah, there's a lot of room for interpretation there. But I mean, I'm kind of siding with you when you posit it that way. But I do see I would entertain the alternative slightly, because humanity would have a more beneficial future than they did in the machine in his eyes.
Last question is from Jenny, and then we'll go to the breakout rooms. Jenny, go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering, it kind of echoes some of the questions. Is the machine technology, or, you know, machine technology or any of human creations necessarily inherently negative, or is it really how we use those? Even our need for safety, right? We do need it. How we use that, are we trapped by it? And also, even in the idea of direct empiricism, right, which is knowledge through sense experience, right, which gave birth to the scientific method, we bring our own filters to everything we observe, even directly. So that's why we have the scientific, we have to test it, observe, test, observe again, test. So I don't know if those were question statements, but that might be.
Yeah, I mean, you really hit the nail on the head with that. It's not the inherent nature of like any technological manifestation. It's morally neutral, and it's depending on how we use it, just as any like weapon you can argue, for example, as well. Yeah, so it's not like we should, you know, demonize like social media, for example, or we should demonize like an iPhone, or we should demonize video chats, or we should demonize any really tool. It's an objective tool. It has no moral interpretation or implication there. Shakespeare says nothing is good or bad, only thinking makes it so. So yeah, it's absolutely, you said it perfectly. It's all on how we use it. People can use these tools, and how they use tools is an extension of their core philosophy. So even if they didn't have the tools, they would still, the tool is a placeholder. They are still going to actualize and express that will through some other device, and this tool is just an intermediary placeholder to express their will easier, more effectively, or exponentially, for example. So yeah, I do completely agree with you on that point.
Excellent. So now we're going to go to breakout rooms. So what are the questions for the breakout rooms, John?
Yes. So I have three. The first one is kind of second. There's two questions in it. The first is, what do you believe is the prime motivating factor or like emotion behind firsthand experience of the world? And conversely, 10th hand. So why would somebody want to have firsthand experience or firsthand judgment of the world? And why would somebody want to have secondhand or 10th hand? So you can maybe make the argument of like, why did Kuno go out to the surface of the earth? Like, what did he believe? And like, what did Vashti believe? Like, you can look at it that way as well. So that's the first question. The second question is, in the beginning of the story, Vashti was, quote, seized with the terrors of direct experience. What do you define that as? What are the terrors of direct experience? What does that mean to you? And why are they terrifying? Why are they fearful? And thirdly, what are the downsides of 10th hand experience? So even though Vashti got information, she read books, she listened to lectures from other people, she had conversations, nothing was from the source. There's a quote in the story itself, and it says, oh no, you shouldn't study like history. You should study what this person thought about what that person thought about what that person thought about what that person thought of history. So it's like literally 10th hand. what are the downsides of that? Like, what are the pitfalls of that? So, quick recap. The first, what are the encouraging factors behind firsthand and 10th hand experience? Second, what are the terrors of direct experience? What does that mean to you? Third, what are the downsides of 10th hand experience?